Walt Henderson had lived nearly a century, and in those years he had seen the very best and the very worst of humanity. A decorated World War II veteran, Walt had once parachuted behind enemy lines, fought with valor, and returned home carrying the weight of memories that most people could never comprehend. Now, at 93 years old, his body was frail, his steps slow, and his hair as white as new snow. But his spirit? That remained unbroken. Walt lived alone on the outskirts of the quiet town of Rockford, in a modest little house surrounded by towering oak trees. His days passed in peaceful routine. He woke up with the sunrise, brewed himself a pot of black coffee, and tended to his small garden out back. He fed the stray cats that had adopted him, and sometimes he sat on his porch for hours, smoking his old pipe and staring out at the world with eyes that had seen more than their share of history. Despite the physical loneliness, Walt never felt truly alone. His memories kept him company. But peace is a fragile thing. One summer evening, that peace was shattered. A group of bikers moved into the long-abandoned house next door. At first, Walt barely noticed. The place had been empty for years, and he figured it was good someone was finally using it again. He watched them unload their bikes and crates, heard their laughter echo across the yard. They were rough-looking men, tattoos snaking down muscular arms, leather jackets worn like armor, and beards as wild as wolves. But Walt wasn't a man to judge based on appearances. He had learned long ago, back in those war years, that the shell of a man often revealed little about the truth inside. So, he nodded politely when he saw them and hoped they'd be good neighbors. That hope didn't last long. The nightmare begins. At first, it was the noise. Every evening, just as the sun was sinking behind the hills, the bikers would rev their engines and tear down the street like wild animals, their bikes screaming like banshees. They blared heavy metal music until the early hours of the morning. Beer bottles began appearing on Walt's lawn, their shattered glass glinting in the morning sun. Walt approached them one evening. He walked slowly but steadily over to their yard, his cane tapping against the pavement. He greeted them politely, asking if they wouldn't mind keeping it down a bit at night. They laughed. The next morning, he found his mailbox smashed in two. A few days later, his American flag, the one that had flown proudly outside his house for decades, was torn from its pole and left crumpled in the dirt. But it wasn't until the graffiti appeared that Walt clenched his weathered fists in quiet rage. Sprayed across his wooden fence in crude red letters were insults mocking his age and his service. Old man. Useless soldier. Go away. Walt stared at the words for a long time. His breathing slowed. His heart pounded not with fear, but with something deeper. He'd faced tyranny before. He knew what it looked like, and he wasn't about to bow to it now. The call that changed everything. Walt shuffled back into his house and closed the door behind him. He sat in his old recliner for a moment, thinking. Then, with deliberate slowness, he reached into a drawer by the phone and pulled out a little black address book. The cover was worn, the pages inside yellowed with time. His gnarled fingers flipped through it until he found the number he was looking for, one he hadn't dialed in decades. He picked up the phone and punched in the numbers. It rang twice. A deep voice answered, gravelly and commanding. "Who's this?" Walt took a steady breath. "It's Henderson. Walt Henderson." There was a pause. Then came a slow chuckle. "Well, I'll be damned. Thought you'd finally given up on favors, old man." Walt allowed himself a faint grin. "So did I. But turns out I got a problem." The voice on the other end grew serious. "Tell me what you need." Walt explained the situation, sparing none of the details. When he was done, the man said, "Give me an hour." An unforgettable night. That night, the bikers were having one of their usual gatherings. They were in the front yard, drinking, laughing, their music blaring from enormous speakers. They didn't hear the new engines at first. Heavier engines, low and rumbling, like thunder rolling across the plains. Then they saw the headlights. Out of the darkness came a convoy of motorcycles, big, military-grade Harley-Davidsons, gleaming in the moonlight. The riders were men like no others, broad shoulders, battle scars, and eyes that had stared down death more times than they could count. Their jackets bore patches from every branch of the armed services: Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. These were no ordinary bikers. These are the Iron Brotherhood. At their head rode a giant of man, his beard thick and gray, his eyes like steel. He brought his bike to a stop directly in front of the gang and climbed off with a slow, deliberate motion. He removed his helmet and stared at the leader of the bikers with a gaze that could have stopped a charging bull. "You got a problem with Walter Henderson?" the man growled. The bikers froze. Their bravado evaporated in an instant. One of them stammered, "It was just a joke. We didn't mean anything by it." The big man took a step forward. "Then you're going to make it right. You're going to clean that fence, fix his mailbox, and replace that flag. Understand?" They nodded, swallowed hard. Respect earned. By sunrise, Walt's property looked better than it had in years. The graffiti was scrubbed clean, the fence repainted. His mailbox stood proudly once more, and a brand-new American flag fluttered gently in the breeze. From that day on, the bikers kept their distance. Some even nodded respectfully when they saw Walt sitting on his porch, a quiet sentinel watching over his land. But the story wasn't quite over yet. A new friendship. A few days later, one of the younger bikers approached. His name was Tyler Mason, and he looked barely 30. He climbed the porch steps slowly, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Walt watched him come, his expression unreadable. "Sir," Tyler said, clearing his throat, I wanted to apologize. I didn't know you were a veteran." "If I had." Walt held up a hand, silencing him. "Respect isn't just for veterans," he said gently. "It's for everyone. The old lady at the grocery store, the kid on the school bus, the guy filling his tank at the gas station. You don't earn respect through war. You earn it by how you treat people." Tyler nodded slowly. "Yeah, I get that now." He hesitated, then added, "You were in World War II, right?" "I was," Walt replied. 101st Airborne. Dropped into Normandy on D-Day. Tyler's eyes widened. That's incredible. I don't know much about that stuff, but I'd like to hear about it sometime." Walt studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded toward an empty chair. "Pull up a seat, son." Over the weeks that followed, Tyler became a regular visitor. He sat for hours, listening to Walt's stories, the battles in Europe, the camaraderie of his squad, the bitter cold of Bastogne. And Walt, who had rarely spoken of the war to anyone, found himself sharing memories he had long kept buried. The old bike. One evening, Tyler showed up with something special. An old Harley-Davidson WLA motorcycle, painstakingly restored. "I found it at a junkyard," Tyler explained. "Figured you might want to take it for a spin." Walt's fingers traced the polished chrome. "Haven't ridden one of these in 70 years. "Well," Tyler grinned, "no time like the present." With some effort, Walt climbed onto the bike. His hands gripped the handlebars, his feet found their place. Tyler gave the engine a kick, and it roared to life. Walt laughed, a deep, youthful sound that hadn't left his throat in years. Neighbors came out to watch as the old soldier took off down the street, riding like the wind. A legacy continued. Inspired by Walt's wisdom, Tyler left the biker gang for good. He joined a local veteran outreach program, helping homeless vets and raising awareness for their needs. In time, he convinced some of his old gang members to do the same. As for Walt, he found new purpose in those final years, sharing his stories, teaching lessons of respect and dignity, and knowing that even in old age, he could still make a difference. The final ride. Years passed. Walt's health declined, but his spirit never faltered. On an autumn morning, feeling the end near, he called Tyler. "Meet me out front," he said. "I want one last ride." Tyler, now in his late 30s and a respected advocate for veterans, arrived with the old military Harley. Walt wore his dress uniform, his medals pinned proudly to his chest. Tyler helped him onto the bike, and they rode. Neighbors stepped outside to salute. The Iron Brotherhood stood at attention as they passed. Walt closed his eyes, felt the wind on his face, and remembered. Somewhere along that road, with the sun setting, Walt Henderson took his final breath. He died as he lived, free, fearless, and on his own terms. The legend lives on. At his funeral, the town gathered. The Iron Brotherhood led the procession. Engines rumbled in solemn tribute. Veterans saluted, and Tyler, standing tall with Walt's old airborne pin on his jacket, vowed to continue his mission. Because some heroes never truly die. They live on in the stories they leave behind. Rest in peace, Walter Henderson. You will never be forgotten.